What's up, witches? Welcome back to another episode of the Better Witch podcast, where we have candid conversations with real life practitioners and professionals. Because when we know better, we witch better. We are broadcasting live from Witchwork, New York City's only co working space for witches. I'm your host, Allie Kravitz, aka Bronx Witch, and I'm the founder of Witchwork and CEO of Better Witch Coaching. You can tune into live tapings of the show from my YouTube channel, Bronx Witch. Today, my guest co-host is Miranda MJ Etkind, and MJ lives a double life. By day, she's a corporate girly with a business degree. By night, she writes romance novels in a cozy book-filled apartment in Boston. When she's not writing, she can be found walking her dog and getting coffee. MJ's most favorite fun fact is that she once took an entire vacation just to visit a bookstore. My kind of witch. Etkind's debut novel, Dishwasher Safe, about a mermaid who falls in love with a dishwasher, the guy who washes dishes, not the appliance, came out in 2024. And you can connect with MJ on her Substack, mjetkind.substack.com, or on Instagram at mjetkinauthor. Welcome. It is so good to see you, MJ. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am great. I am better now because I have been really looking forward to this conversation, especially since I got my copy of your latest book, which we are definitely going to get into. And before we get into anything, I feel like there's a first order of business here. If you're here in the chat over on YouTube, let's see some applause emojis. Okay. I want to give a round of applause to MJ for bringing me something that I have always wanted to see, which is a story about a witch that I feel like I can actually relate to. Oftentimes, the stories about witches are kind of typical, it's always the story of somebody not knowing about their power and being really like small and overlooked. And then they discover that they come from a magical long line of witches. And oh my gosh, now everything is better. And like, that's a fun story. We all, have that fantasy of like, the Harry Potter story. One day we get a letter that's like, you're actually the strongest wizard in the world or something. But I think that story has definitely been very much done. Yes, we've got folks in the comments, round of applause. I feel like that kind of story has very much been done, and it's not necessarily one that I can relate to. So I'm excited to have a protagonist that like I really feel like I can vibe with, and I'm looking forward to that. But before we get into your newest project and this really cool and unique story about a witch, I want to talk a little bit more about like you and your life, because in a lot of ways I feel like your protagonist kind of mirrors your actual experience, and I feel like a lot of our audience are also living double lives. I feel like a lot of the better witches out there, all the Bronx witches out there, are working by day doing something that probably doesn't feel very magical at all, and then coming home and either engaging in spiritual practices because that's just what they want to do, or it's a part of their like personal lives, or they might actually be spiritual entrepreneurs. They might be trying to create businesses around the services and products and things that they make. So I wanted to first talk a little bit about like what your life is like, or I guess this double life of yours is really like. What does day look like for you, and then what's night like for you?
Yeah, that's like such a great question. So I am in finance. I'm an accountant, and I have been for almost 15 years now. And so I've been really fortunate. I have a great job where I mostly work from home, but I juggle multiple clients at the same time. So my desk always has 3 or 4 computers kind of scattered about. I've got 3 or 4 emails going. So quite hectic. Client services, trying to juggle a ton of hats, and so. That's kind of my day. And then in the evening, writing is kind of where I can focus. And it's not so much kind of the pinging of email, but it's able to focus on kind of this like string of thoughts, and it maybe sounds a little crazy, but it's very relaxing for me to be able to kind of sit down and get away from some of the technology, and just kind of have this singular story to work through.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like that's the case for a lot of folks. Their evening time is like their sacred time where they're able to focus on things that they'd really like to, and what they do during the day kind of maybe provides for that and allows for them to do that, like financially and things of that nature. And I imagine that your day is not quite like Miriam's. Right,
Not
Miriam,
quite.
our protagonist in your latest book, The Witch of Wall Street. And obviously, when being able to write fiction or create depictions of witches, we have a lot more liberties, and we can have spells happening in the middle of the day and things like that, right? And we know that magic, as we practice it, maybe doesn't happen quite that way. But are there some ways in which your interest in the craft, your own personal spirituality, like comes up during your workday, or are they so separate that like they really never touch each other?
It depends. Like for the most part, they don't touch each other. But I will say, like, if I've got a very kind of just rote task, sometimes I'll kind of escape into what I'm writing and I'm able to kind of workshop it in the back of my mind. But a lot of times it has to wait until after I finish for the day, just for the nature of what writing is. So unfortunately, they don't have a lot of overlap. But I do work in a job that is very analytical, and sometimes some of that storytelling comes out in that analysis. So that's maybe the one thing that has the overlap.
Yeah, yeah. And like what is, writing about witches is, I think, even though I feel like it's a lot more popular now, like witches are kind of like enjoying a little bit of like a fun time in history where we are seeing like really cool characters, and we saw the craft get remade. And so we've got like the discovery of witches was really popular for a while, Lovecraft Country, like we've got these different media depictions of witches in various different lights, positive, negative, what have you. American Horror Story, of course, featuring witches for a couple of seasons. But like, what made you interested in wanting to write about a magical character in the first place? And like, where does the craft, if it does, like fit into your own life and your own personal interests?
Yeah, so I've always just loved magic and witches and science fiction and fantasy. So a lot of people kind of grew up with Harry Potter. I was definitely one of them. Um, Obviously softened a little bit and more recently. So that was a big inspiration. But there were also like there was this like really kind of unique Harry Potter knockoff called the Magickers, which was American. These kids went to like a magic summer camp. I read a lot of Mercedes Lackey, which were about like magic horses, Star Wars, which is about magic space wizards. So I always loved kind of these magical stories. And I think my writing has always kind of been there. And so witches were like a very natural progression to writing more about magic, and kind of developing how I kind of saw magic. The Witch of Wall Street came about a lot because I liked the title. I'm like, that's a really cool title. Um, and I'm like, I work in finance. I think I can make something of it. So that's kind of how I ended up with a book about witches in our world. So yeah, that's my kind of
Yeah, well, I
history.
agree. I think it's very catchy. But it also is kind of like what I was saying earlier, like an unusual pairing. Because I do feel like our witchy characters in fiction novels are often they're just not often corporate. And like I think of a
Yeah.
discovery of witches, for example, she's like a librarian or like museum curator type things. Like I feel like it's often someone in a less strenuous work environment, a less corporate work environment, and something that's a little bit more adjacent to like living a witchy life in the first place, right? Like if you're working in a library and you're
Mhm.
surrounded by books, like that's just a good setup for like a lot of the typical types of like witch interaction. So this being like a different vibe entirely, I think is a nice departure. And in your like because you're spending some of the day like in finance, you're working with clients and things like that. I imagine the topic of like spirituality, magic, things like that, tarot, like don't come up. But have they ever, or like, have there been interesting times where maybe you have found yourself like connecting with another person or a client who's like, they're witchy too?
I would say like book like when you connect with someone who's like into fantasy books or into like
Mm.
even romance books, which are really very fantasy based. Those are, I think, that very similar to that moment where you're like, oh, you have this like not just similar interest but similar passion. And I think one of the things actually I write about in the book is that Miriam, the main character, her magic is specifically chaos magic, and
Mm.
she's kind of like grappling with that. And I was talking to my sister, and she's like, "This is kind of like an analogy for masking." I'm like, "Yes," and I think it's kind of an analogy for masking these like interests that don't necessarily align with being super corporate or kind of in the mainstream or don't align with kind of I want to say like the patriarchy, really, right? Like um that are written off as too feminine or not serious enough. And I think magic has a lot of overlap. And I think in general, like things that women practice and like have that as well. And I think we see a lot of Miriam in her own double life. A lot of what she's hiding is also her magic,
Mm.
um, from her colleagues. And I think a lot of that is kind of that analogy of what women hide about themselves in the corporate world. And I think that's kind of how some of the overlap of magic exists, and that a lot of times you have to hide your magic.
Yeah, I really, really feel that. I do feel that in the corporate space, a lot of different groups of people are not encouraged to like take center stage, take up space, share their personal interests or like their genuine personality. And like in your experience working in the finance field, like have you found that there's maybe a shift or a change with that? Because I feel like the world is becoming a bit more open to spirituality, to magic, to all to groups, people who are members of marginalized groups that were not necessarily encouraged to like take center stage or speak up. Do you see or experience like a shift with that amongst like just the people you interact with on a regular basis?
Um, I think it's definitely split. I definitely think as I'm in the kind of more rank and file, absolutely. I think people are more encouraged to just be more individuals and they're not as forced into like a very corporate mindset. But I think when you look especially at some of the investment banking that I talk about or private equity, it is still a lot of like going to the country club or going to like the city club or going out to a golf game. So I think a lot of those, which I also I think intersect with class and race, right? Like in how people who aren't kind of just straight white men are able to sit in these spaces. So I think there's a shift to an extent, and I think there's definitely a shift um, for people kind of below this glass ceiling where you can get to maybe the glass ceiling's gone up a little bit, but I think there's still very much kind of a ceiling that's very hard to break if you don't fit into like a certain kind of group, essentially. So I think it's getting better, but I think there's so much progress left,
Yeah,
especially in
yeah.
finance.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I am happy to see like some of the shifts that are happening, in just in terms of like different voices being heard in these spaces, and there being a willingness, I think, like across the board for people to like. It's refreshing, I think that's sort of how I feel about The Witch of Wall Street. That like it's refreshing to hear a different story. You kind of get bored. When the story is always the same, and I think that's true in even a corporate environment where even if the status quo is like comfortable or you're kind of a part of it and you're welcomed into it, I would imagine that at some point it does get a little bit boring to just sort of always see copy cutters, like
Hmm.
what is it, cookie cutter like versions of people and storylines and backgrounds. And I think in general people are just kind of thirsty for like more diversity and more interesting stories to learn about.
Yeah. And the like the more diverse your group, like your workforce is, your group is, your management is, whatever, you're going to have better brainstorming, like better problem solving, because you've just got people who have seen the world in so many different ways, and they're able to think about the world in different ways, and it's not just stuck on like we all went to the same university, or we all went to the same boarding school and the same university, right?
Mhm.
Especially in investment banking, where you do have so much of this kind of very rigidness to that path. And I'm not an investment banker. I've never worked in investment banking, but I do work with investment bankers, and I see this quite often. Um, and so I think like when you're able to expand that diversity and you have people from different backgrounds, you just are going to have a better business, right, in every way.
Mhm.
And you're going to have different voices, and they're going to think about how to do things fresher, better, different, more creatively. Um, and so I think that it's so important to bring that in.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And speaking of um, earlier when you were mentioning like the separation between like the day job that you have and the things that you do during the day versus like writing at night and the personal things that you explore, I'm wondering how, and I'm sure like a lot of the folks listening in would wonder this too, like how do you shift gears from sort of mentally being in like a very like regimented and financial space, very like a mathematical type of a space, to then being in a headspace where you are a lot more creative, a lot more like in magic we would talk about like masculine energy versus feminine energy,
Mm.
like switching between those two things. So like, do you have any rituals or things that you do at the end of the day to get you into like the creative writing mode, and what are they so that we can totally jack them?
Oh yeah. It's gonna sound so simple. I take a walk.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, so I get outside, I let my mind wander a little bit. I get like out lately, like I said, I've been working from home, so I get out of my apartment. I get some fresh air, and as I walk, that kind of gets my mind going, and it allows me to shift and start to think of the book. And then I'm very early in drafting something new right now, and so a lot of it is drafting a very short amount of words, 500 words, in a sitting, which is only like 30 minutes of writing,
Mhm.
15 minutes of writing. I'm not as fast as some people.
Mm.
Um, and then I'll write a little bit, and then maybe I'll go for a walk. If it's late, maybe I'll kind of lay, like it's time to go to sleep. Like that'll resonate with me for a little bit, and I'll start to have more ideas as well. So I think it's a lot of walking, putting that kind of period on the day. The other thing I do when I write is a lot of times I'll write like in bed at the end of the day, and I'll leave my phone in a different room, and I'll try to get away from, again, some of that like pinging of social media, pinging of work emails that tend to go quite late depending on what I'm doing at the time. And so that's the other thing that I think is good, is to be able to put that separation
Mm.
on some of the technology as well. And I write on my computer, but not
Yeah.
all the
Oh,
time.
I'm definitely gonna well, first of all, I have been walking lately. And you are absolutely right about like I wouldn't really think of how impactful that is because it seems like so very like, oh yeah, go for a walk. Okay, fine. But I have been trying to like regulate my nervous system better, just realizing like how go 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 and survival mode I've been in for like a lot of my life, for personal reasons, and then opening my business here, Witchwork, which is where I am right now, and building a business from scratch all on my own for the last 3 years. It's definitely got my body in like survival mode, and I've been, now that I realize that, I've been trying to introduce things to help me just regulate better and be less anxious and be less wound up, and be able to sleep better and all of those good things. And walking has been huge for me. I've just been walking like 3 days a week in the park by my house. Nothing fancy, nothing elaborate. Sometimes it's 20 minutes, a couple times I've pushed myself to a whole hour. But what that walking has done for me has been incredible in terms of like reducing my anxiety and like burning off energy, but also stimulating ideas. Just being outside and thinking about things and watching people walk by, and like I don't consider myself a writer. I've definitely never written like a piece of fiction. But if I were, I could imagine that just being outside and like people watching, seeing different people can inspire characters and storylines and all types of things. So I love that. So I definitely encouraging our listeners to give that a try, but also putting your phone in a separate room I think is a big one, and I want to try that because I usually have, first of all, I have two phones, which is just like, oh my god. But we have a physical location here, and then I have my personal phone, so we have a phone for the space here, and I use that for making content and stuff. And so sometimes I'm literally like on the same platform on two different phones in both hands, like, oh my god, like put them down. So I think that's a really great tip, to put the phone in another room, just for like 30 minutes, so that
Yeah.
it's not distracting you while you let yourself do something else. I think that's really great.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And I think too, just the other thing, just on walking, not to belabor the conversation, but it's also good because your mind is not in a specific spot, right? Like you're not sitting down to say, I've got to get through 7 emails or whatever, right? Like it's just your mind's allowed to wander, and you're not stuck in that, specific space or that specific task list that, never seems to end. So that's the other thing
Hmm.
I love about it as well.
Yeah, never ending is definitely
Yeah.
like how that goes. Well, I definitely want to get into more about the writing process,
Yeah.
because I'm sure that some of our listeners are also writers and or thinking about being writers. They might have projects that they're really like interested in talking about, and becoming a writer is definitely like a big deal. It's a big undertaking. I would say writing a piece is intense, but then also like getting it out there. So before we get into getting it out there, because I definitely have like personal questions about that process and things
Yeah.
like that. What was it like writing your first book? Like, how much time did you dedicate to that? You mentioned writing for 30 minutes. If I were writing for 30 minutes a day, like, how long is it going to take me to actually get a book done? What was that process like for you? And how long did it take?
Yeah, so 30 minutes just at the beginning, but the further I get into a book, the longer I'll write. So it, and then towards the end, I'll often write like 4 to 8 hour sessions, like on the weekends. So I'll
Mhm.
go quite long. So my very first book, I went fairly fast. I think I drafted about the first draft, not the end, but the first draft, it took about 5 weeks.
Mm.
Yeah, and then from there, a couple of months of refining, reading through, getting it ready for the editors to go through. So the I'll back up a little bit. The very first thing I do, I'm an outliner. In the writing world, there's something called a planter or a pantster or a plotter. Whether you plot everything or you just make it up as you go. In the
Mm.
middle is a planter where you kind of get your story going, and then you plant it and grow it and water it. And I would kind of put myself in the middle. So I don't have a fairly extensive outline, but I typically start outlining first.
Mhm.
That's not a long process, and it'll shift over time. It shifts while I'm writing, and I have like this document where I have like characters and kind of temp poles that I put down, and then I'll start to kind of write in earnest. I'll usually get about 5,000 words in. I'll reevaluate that outline. I'll think about the characters, and I'll usually make quite a bit of shift in that kind of those early days as I meet the characters, so to speak.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
I'll sit down and be quite intense about it. I'm a big cafe writer. I will write at home. I write in bed, but on the weekends I like to go to like a cafe or a bar and just get out. Especially again working at home, it's nice to not do this
Mhm.
at home. Um, so that's kind of the writing process. And then once I am in kind of the first draft is done, I'll do a very thorough read through where I'm doing a lot of rewriting, a lot of adding. I'll add scenes, I'll move stuff around. And then once I'm happy with that, I'll start to do my text to speech
Mm.
read. So I do text to speech. I'm dyslexic, and
Okay.
so that is like crucial to writing because it's really hard for me to catch some of those typos, just with how my brain processes information. And then I'll do one more read, um, and kind of make some additional changes, and then I'll start to send it to friends and beta readers to take a look and get their feedback. And then once all of that is done, it'll go to my editors. So That is
Okay. Well, first of all, it sounds like you need a witch work in your neighborhood. Okay. So you have somewhere cozy, cute, and witchy to go to. That's much better than a cafe. But I'm glad that you have those options. And I definitely can see how getting out of the house, and kind of similar to the writing, just being out in the world, can be inspiring and change up your pace and make the writing process not feel like monotonous and boring. And like it's exciting, it's something different, every time. And I'm like so blown away that you were able to write your first book in 5 weeks. Like, I feel like that's such a short period of time. And like, I have been playing around with writing something and it's literally taken years for me to just
yeah.
like get a chapter done. So that's like really impressive.
Yeah, I should back up before that. So I have been like a long time fan fiction writer, like since I was a kid, but not actually. So before the pandemic, I had kind of picked it up again, and then during the pandemic, I wrote like 600,000 words in 2 years. So I got very good at writing quickly and turning things quickly,
Yeah.
and I got quicker as that process went, and so that's part of the reason. So by the time they say that like I think you're probably familiar with like the 10,000 hours, like to
Hmm.
master something, you do 10,000 hours. And writing, they say 1 million words. And so by the time I had gotten um, to draft a novel, I was well in 1 million words. I had written a bunch of stuff that I never wanted to publish, that I never finished. I'd written a bunch of fan fiction. And so I was well in that 1 million words. So by the time I got to writing a novel, like it wasn't the first kind of time I sat down to write, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, no, that definitely makes sense and is helpful because I'm like, oh, okay, great. Okay, 5 weeks may not be for me, because I'm not there
It's fast.
yet.
It's
Yeah, that
fast.
is
It's like
fast.
yeah, it's like the nano. So I've never done National Novel Writing Month in earnest, but it's very much kind of the NaNoWriMo model where you sit down and you just get something done and
Mm.
then you go back and workshop it. And so I think for a lot of writers, just making yourself say like I'm going to write very very quickly and I'm going to get something done and I'll fix it later. So
I love that. Oh, we just got a cool comment. The medium Lauren says, love hearing your process. I join writers groups virtually on the weekend once a month to dedicate 3 to 4 hours to my writing. That is awesome. The group name is Just a Black Girl Writing Away on Eventbrite. That's cool, for people to look into. And I love that you have that type of space. It sounds like writing is a muscle. It's like a something that gets stronger over time. So if you are writing frequently, then when you get to the point where maybe writing an entire novel is something you want to do, then you'll have the muscle strength there, to put it out. But perhaps if you haven't put in that work just yet, it will take you longer and require more concerted effort to like get it done.
yeah, exactly. And I think like I don't know why I think about it as a sports analogy because I'm not a sports person at any means, but
It's helpful.
if you think about like playing soccer or something, right? Like you have to know how to run and you have to know how to kick a ball and you have to know like all of these skills that are not necessarily playing soccer. They're things that kind of go into it. And then you have to learn how to play the game and then you have to like play your first game before like your first scrimmage before you're ready to like go not to the pros but to anything serious. And I think writing is very similar to that, and that you need to build up to these. So you have to obviously like spelling and grammar, but then you have to be able to kind of do a narrative, and then once you get a narrative together then you can start to put it together into something longer. So I definitely think it makes sense to practice at all of these stages versus thinking you have to go straight to I'm going to write a novel today, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. And then you mentioned using text, to speech or speech to text.
yeah, text to speech. Yeah.
Text to speech. Okay. So like how does that help in the process? Is it basically just reading it back to yourself so
Mhm.
that you can hear if there are like grammatical errors or spelling situations?
Yeah, so grammatical and spelling, but also sometimes it's just a different way to review the work. So sometimes I'll
Mm.
change like what's happening in the novel based on like what I hear. Sometimes it's great to get dialogue cleaned up. Sometimes I'll have like repetitive words. Sometimes I'll have repetitive pieces of dialogue where I've like kind of repeated myself. So it's just a different way to look at it, where you're not just like staring at the same thing over and over again. So it's a way to review your novel without feeling like you're just in an endless hole.
Yeah, I think that's genius. It never even occurred to me to do that, to like have your piece spoken back to you. I'd imagine that's a really helpful tip for like speech writing, writing scripts for videos or anything. Really,
Yeah.
so I'm definitely gonna. That's one I'm gonna tuck away because that's a really good tip for sure.
Yeah. It's like anything. I'll like do it for emails and stuff now too.
Oh yeah, yeah. I should be using that more often. I feel like it probably also helps with like multitasking if you have to like if your hands need to be busy with something, but you can listen
Yeah,
into
exactly.
something. I love that. That's a really great tip. Well, I think this is also a really good time for us to take a quick break. So that's exactly what we are going to do. We will be back with more from MJ in just a second. This is also a good time for all of my YouTubers to drop your questions for MJ down in the chat. We are going to be getting to that in the second part of the episode as well. So we'll be back in just a second. What's up, witches? While you're refilling your teas, I want to talk to my boss witches out there. Okay. If you have a witchy business, product, or service that you want to get in front of thousands of witches, like the thousands of witches that tune into this show, then an ad spot is the best way to do that. Ad spots for season 4 are now open. The Better Witch podcast has been downloaded over 16,000 times. Can you believe that? I'm so grateful for that. But what would you do with 16,000 new followers, customers, or clients? How would that help your witchy business? A lot, I would imagine. So definitely get in now. The details for how you can secure an ad spot in season 4 of the Better Witch podcast are in the description box down below. All right, we are back. We are back with MJ, and we were just talking a little bit about some of the actual process of writing a book for you, and how you've been able to write the books that you have. And I want to talk a little bit about the next step, because we talked about writing and reviewing it and getting it, off to an editor to read it over and things like that. But then the next step is actually publishing it. And so you are self-published for both books. Is that correct?
Correct. Correct. Yep.
So incredible. And I'm imagining that self-publishing is something that people are doing more and more these days. It makes the getting your book out there more accessible. You don't have to go through a publisher or strike up a deal. You really have like full autonomy and independence and things like that. And I imagine if you went that route for your first book, it must have worked out because you're going that route for your
Yeah.
second book again. But if you were going to kind of start all over with the process of getting your book out into the world, would you still self-publish? And if so, is there something that you would tell like new writer MJ to know about the self-publishing process?
Um, yeah. So if I would do it again, I would self-publish. So the alternative is querying your work. So essentially, you send. I don't know a ton about it, but you send out like a letter to an agent, a lot of letters to agents, and you um, hope that someone will pick up your book. And it's what I understand like a really heartbreaking and demoralizing process because it is so many no's. Like people talk about getting 500 no's, and then their book still won't get up picked up. People will say, well, I'm only going to go for a year, and that's usually not enough time. So people are spending 2 or 3 or 4 years. Um, so I knew I wanted my work out there. I didn't want it to be kind of stuck in this years long querying process.
Mm,
Um, and I didn't want to be stuck. I love my books, but I also did not want to be stuck kind of with them for 5 years of kind of hustling them,
mm,
which is why I chose to self-publish. That doesn't mean I will stay a self-published author in the future. It just means for me right now, like that has been the best.
mhm.
Of course, I do think maybe as I write more, as my books hopefully grow in popularity, I might consider querying. But for now, self-publishing works the best for me. Um,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
think was, yeah.
So if folks are like thinking about going that route, it sort of sounds like one of the considerations was not going through the querying process, not, being beholden to the publisher's schedule for when you can get your book out into the world. But also, there's sort of like a commitment because now you're in this agreement to promote this book and, make sure you get the sales that the
Yeah.
publisher wants, to get. And so you're really tied to that work potentially for a period of time that maybe might exceed your genuine like excitement about it. Because I know
Yeah.
a lot of creators of different kinds, like say once they've created something, they're kind of like over it. And they're like, once it's done, they're like, I don't really want to keep talking about it. I made it, it's out in the world, go do the thing. And if you're publishing with a publisher, you kind of maybe can't really do that because you have these obligations to
Yeah.
the agreement you made with them.
Yeah, and it's also just that very long period. I think it's probably like at this point 18 months to 2 years between when your book sells and it hits the shelf
Mm-hmm.
versus and it's not taking people that much longer to write them. It's just that's how long the publishing process has been drawn out lately in terms of very long promo processes. I mean, I think there are books that are coming out next month that have had arcs out since like November or October, right? So they've been on this, 6-month long promo tour, which means these books were written, a year before that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's just kind of being stuck there for a long time versus being able to get your work out and kind of get a very high quality product, but getting it through without so much of the red tape of publishing.
Yeah, yeah, I could definitely. That was something that I hadn't considered before because I think that like the dream for a lot of writers or just anybody who wants to get a book out there is to go with the publisher because you have all of the like support and the distribution and the promotional backing and things that they can give you, but you really are also very much like at their, you have to kind of do things according to like when they would want to do them and for how long they need to like see a return on the investment. So there's definitely less control there that I hadn't like thought about, which I think is helpful for the aspiring writers out there to know about. But obviously publishing for yourself is not an easy undertaking because now you're doing all of that stuff that a publisher would do for yourself. You're promoting yourself. You need to set deadlines for yourself and like stick to them. And if you have an audience that's maybe waiting for you to get your book out, then you want to honor that and things of that nature. So, what is it like in terms of the actual undertaking of publishing for yourself? Like, should I not go that route unless I have like X amount of dollars in the bank? Or should I not go that route if I don't have like a huge following? Or, what can I expect from publishing for myself if that's something I'm considering?
Yeah, so I had virtually no following when I started this. I have a small, I think, but growing following, hopefully. So I don't think you need a following. People do this all the time without a following. In terms of dollars in the bank, I think that's more complicated. You can do this without spending any money. Like literally, you can do this without. I mean, besides for maybe like a Microsoft Word subscription, and maybe a little bit for some formatting software, but technically like you can do your cover design on your own. I would not recommend it. I'll tell a story about that in just a second. You
Yes,
can
love a
self
story.
yeah, you can self edit. Again, I wouldn't recommend it. I got really really lucky. I have amazing editors that I got connected through a fan fiction contact. Some mild mannered editors. Courtney and Sarah have done an amazing job with both my books. So I'll give them a shout out. So you can do these items like you can do it essentially for free. Amazon will give you a free ISBN. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that in a second as well. And you can put your work up without any edit or with like being self-edited, right, using these text to speech. Again, I would highly caution about that, but you can do it. So these are all options. Like you don't actually have to have any money to self-publish. um, so that's kind of the short answer. The longer answer is that it depends what your goals are, right? Like if you're looking to I don't want to say compete, but if you're looking to be kind of at the level of your traditionally published peers, you are going to have to probably spend a little bit of money in some places, right? Like you do, it does not, unless you're maybe already someone who has a lot of editing, like professionally trained editing experience, you probably need editors. We talked about my job in finance, like I'm dyslexic, like this could not happen without editors. Like it needed that. And I'm very grateful like with how polished it feels afterwards. In terms of covers, the current cover on Dishwasher Safe I did not design. I originally designed my own cover. You can still find it. It's still on bookshop.org. Um, it's still the Strand books if you search the book there. So it's still out there. I designed that cover and it's not great and it did not sell well. And I will say I did my advanced reader copies on NetGalley with the Dishwasher Safe, the old cover I designed. And I did the Witch of Wall Street with this newer cover, and it was like night and day in terms of how many requests I got, how much feedback I've gotten. I've already gotten more feedback on the Witch of Wall Street a week before it comes out than I ever have on Dishwasher Safe. So,
Wow.
yeah, so the covers make such a big difference, and it's hard. It's hard because what originally happened with Dishwasher Safe is I went to try to find cover designers, and I didn't know how to do it. And I went to Upwork and I posted for a cover designer, and I got tons of requests, and all of them were fraud. Like all of them were scams. Like 500 requests of like scam
What?
of people sharing the same portfolio over and over again. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and so I'm like, I got really scared. I'm like, this is obviously like fraud, scams, whatever. And so I stopped that process. Like, I'll see what I can do. And I bought like a $30 mermaid on like Shutterstock or whatever for like it's not a stock photo, but it's like just a vector image that I was able to kind of cut out in Photoshop, and it did not look great. But that's what I went with because it was like such a horrific process. And then I found Miblart, Miblart, and they are a company that does covers, and they did The Witch of Wall Street and just absolutely blew it out of the water. I adore that cover so much. So that's kind of my like story on covers. There are ways you can do it which aren't as bad as my story on your own, but it does impact how you're able to sell and do your marketing. And like I said, it has been night and day on marketing, just having like a better cover. Um, so the answer is you don't have to have a ton of money. You can do it at a lot of different price points depending on like I probably do it a little bit more expensive. I'm really fortunate. Like I've had this job in finance. I've have the privilege and the funds to self-fund this. But you can also do it a lot cheaper as well. Um, and bootstrap it a little bit more. I think in terms of followers, I think there's kind of this idea in the current world that you just have to go viral on TikTok. You just have to go viral on TikTok. And books going viral does happen, but it happens even like less than like I went viral for my dog doing something funny. So I wouldn't,
Right.
yeah, I wouldn't like bank on that and like try not to chase the algorithm. And I do post on TikTok. They're not good. So that's
Mm.
my
Yeah. Well, first of all, the cover of The Witch of Wall Street is absolutely phenomenal. I'm showing it now for the listeners. You'll have to grab yourself a copy. But for those of you watching on YouTube, I've got my copy here because MJ was so kind to send me a copy before it even drops next week. So I'm really excited to get into it. And I'm incredibly grateful for the beautiful promo box that you sent along. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that, knowing that you are publishing for yourself. I was like, wait a minute. I know that this is not like a major publisher sending this out. And the box was incredible. Detail was thought of. All of every side of the box is designed. It's a beautiful box. Like I didn't even want to throw the box away because I was like, this is really nice. But then, the lovely tea mug inside and my saucer, and like it was just a really beautiful box, which obviously required, investment
yeah.
on your part. It's great obviously to have a job and, then be able to use funds from that in order to first of all, to self-publish, but also to like promote yourself in this way. But not everybody does that. Not everybody who self-publishes, even if they have the funds, decide to put as much like detail and effort into what you created. So what was some of the thought process behind deciding to make like a really notable promo box, and what gave you like the guts to invest in yourself at that level?
Yeah. In terms of why I did it, oh, I know I did it. Um, so this summer, this is so goofy. This summer, um, Casey McQuestion, if you know Red, White, and Royal Blue,
Yeah.
came out with a new book called The Pairing.
Yeah.
And it is, I would say, quite spicy in the romance world. Um,
Ooh.
and their publisher did a promo box, and it had a very controversial item in it for
Ooh.
adults.
Okay.
Um, and it set the internet, the bookish internet, off like crazy. And like I knew
Wow.
mine was not going to be controversial because I was not A, I didn't have the money to put that sort of thing in. But B, that was not kind of the theme of my book either.
Right.
Um, and I'm like, oh, like this was the point. The point was the controversy with these
Mm.
boxes, right? Like some people embraced it, some people didn't. And I think the publisher knew that this was going to be the point. And I'm like, okay, this worked well. It got people talking. Mine's not going to get people talking as much, but at least it kind of is out there. And then I think also just getting other people to do social media for me is like maybe the biggest thing. So if that's a lot of arcs, right? Like I only have so much of a reach. I'm not a social media native in any sense. Like I did not really have Instagram until um, a year ago.
Oh wow.
Yeah, like I had, I think an Instagram is like my Facebook generated my Instagram, and my Facebook is from college because I'm that old. Um, but yeah, so like I didn't do Instagram. And so I didn't have a following. So getting people who are better at social media to help me is like was a lot of the impetus. But I think the Casey question box was for the pairing was kind of what spurred the idea that I should do this.
Yeah.
Um and then the guts to invest in myself. So I I think I like am very anti-hustle culture, and by being anti-hustle culture I tricked myself into hustling as I was thinking about it, because I the way I look at this, I'm like, look, I don't necessarily need to make money off the book. I can look at this as like it's not a get rich quick scheme. I call it like a get slow or get poor slow scheme. And like I can invest in this like it's a hobby. Like my hobbies are books, which are not very expensive. Um and maybe some travel, but I'm not even traveling as much as I was when I was younger. So I'm like, okay, this can be my hobby. I can make like the quote unquote investment in it. And therefore like I don't have infinite funds, but this idea that every dollar I spend I have to make back, I've kind of not embraced, which is not great business
Mm.
advice. Like I would never advise someone in business to just like spend more money than you'll ever make.
Right.
But from like a personal hobby sense, that's kind of how I think about it. So it's kind of probably
Mm.
how I've tricked myself into hustling this a little bit. Like I don't hustle it, and then I actually do when I send like
Yeah.
2,000 emails out. So
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think I feel like I hear this a lot, and maybe it's not the best business model. Obviously, the idea of a business is to profit. And so, writing books as a business, like writing a book with the purpose of sales and needing to live off of that and things like that. This is probably like not the best approach, in which case, maybe working with a publisher might be a better way to go about that, because at least those upfront costs, are covered by them. And then you can figure out how to monetize the success of the book and things like that. But I have heard what you're saying echoed quite a bit by creatives, artists, people that are creating art, whether it's music, writing books, movies, films, whatever, that really are coming from a place of like just a deep desire to get the work out into the world, not necessarily anticipating, planning for, or expecting it to become like their business and translate into, income that they can live off of. And then sometimes what ends up happening is that that happens anyway. And the thing that they created was so successful that in fact it does become a business and they are able to live off of it. But I've heard quite a few people in the creative spaces that like have really big names and have blown up, all coming from deciding to invest in themselves, and to, pay for their own short film to get made, or pay for their own books to get out into the world, pay to make their own music videos, or record their own albums. And there seems to be something really like magical about that, for just because I come at everything from like a witchy perspective, but just the way that I look at magic and the craft is, all boils down to energy, and the way that energy moves, and the way in which you can build something really powerful by concentrating energy in a certain place, and putting in as much energy as you can, to really like propel, what you were trying to create into reality. And so I see not necessarily folks that are business minded, but creatives that really just need to make things and share them with the world, taking the step and deciding to invest in themselves, and sometimes quite like intensely, and saying, you know what, I want to make like the best version of what I am making. And I want it to be the best reflection of what I am capable of. And if it goes somewhere, it goes somewhere. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But the idea is I am going to show the world, what I can do and what I can make. And yeah, so I think approaching a creative process from a business perspective, obviously keeping your costs as low as possible is going to be a very important factor, but that kind of goes out of the window a little bit if you are approaching it from the creative perspective of just wanting to get it out into the world.
Yeah, and I think even people who are like not self-funding are also always self-funding. So I think if you think of like TV writers is a really good example. TV writers have to move out to LA and take jobs which will never pay their student loans off and won't even pay
Mm,
rent, and hustle through often that process for 5 or 10 years. And so even though they may end up as at a big studio, or they may end up as a showrunner one day, like they had to really like take horrible jobs to get there,
mhm,
right? And often work multiple jobs. Actors, musicians, even actually writers who are traditionally published. Most traditionally published writers, I think, their book deals are going to be between $50 and $100,000, $150,000. You have to pay out your agent. You're maybe putting out, um, like most people are not putting out 7 books a year. Most people are putting out 1 book a year. Some people are superstars that can put out 2 books a year, right?
mhm,
And so these are not like and then we just talked about like this 2 year long deal cycle. So a lot of people who are traditionally published, like they have some extra money, which is great, but they are not um, able to live off of it. Even actually big names, unless they are committed to putting out a book every single year, they are
mm,
probably also working a job, because there's just not that much money in publishing unless you're like a celebrity memoirist and you get a
mhm.
7-figure deal.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. I think that's really like good to know and to keep in mind. And I think also just like encouragement for folks to do that, because as a business coach, um, I find that people can hesitate, to make that investment in themselves. And I think that there is, obviously everyone has their circumstances, and, we don't want people to be like completely bankrupt, necessarily. But that when you really love something that you've created and you believe in it and you want to get it out into the world, that to the extent that you can, investing in yourself and putting in as much as possible to create the best version of that, I think at the end of the day, regardless of what it does for your ability to pay your bills, is just like going to be incredibly satisfying for someone who's genuinely creative and really feels like what they have to offer is going to be a benefit to the world in some way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I would say like don't I would never take out like a personal loan to self-publish. Don't rack up credit card debt. Like that is I would say probably fairly bad advice, but if you have the disposable income, right? If you're able to take off money from other kind of fun things, right, to put it into self-publishing, I would definitely recommend that.
Yeah, yeah, same. I think that's really great. Well, The Witch of Wall Street is going to be dropping just a week from now on March 25th. I am really excited to get into it. So I will be dropping the link to the book where you can get it on my bookshop.org storefront, which is a great platform for buying books that support indie bookstores. So if you're looking for alternatives to some of the big box options, then Bookshop is a great one. And I will definitely include my link in the comments so that you all can pre order a copy of The Witch of Wall Street, and get your hands on it because I'm already like just so excited about it. Just seeing the love that you put into the box, I was like, oh, okay, this is somebody who really cares about the work that they've created. And I find sometimes that things featuring witches are a little bit like I said, like redundant and a little bit sloppy and like so your box alone really showed me that this is something that you're really proud of, and I'm excited to get into the book and learn all about Miriam and her magical and romantic story. Let's take some questions from the chat if we have any before we let you go. I see that the medium Lauren has asked a question. She says, I'm writing a book to transmute my childhood and show people growing up in hoarder/neglect circumstances that they can surpass their learning and social setbacks and to embrace mental health awareness. MJ, do you have any suggestions or tips for working through writing about trauma?
Ooh.
Mm,
Um,
we
so
got deep right there.
I know. I had kind of a very odd childhood. Um, and I have not actually been able to write about it. I will say this, I'm working on something, I'm again not very far into it. But it is a little bit of a heavier book, and I'm finding that the better my mental health is, the happier I am, the easier it is to write. And so I would say like, and I don't know if this is like the best advice, but I think yeah, the more you're able to take care of your own mental health first, the easier it'll be to write it versus don't I don't know that working through deciding that like this is how you're going to cure your mental health by writing it. And for some people that might work. For me, it doesn't. For me, like if I start writing it, um it's like scratching at an open wound. Um, but the better like I'm able to work through my mental health before, the better place I am in to handle those heavier topics. And I find that the happier I am with my writing, the happier I am with my life, the more I can handle really like heavier, darker topics.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine that being the case because writing about trauma that is like personal to you or inspired by your own life story, I would imagine will bring up a lot of things and kind of take you in a like reliving it kind of a
Mhm.
place. And so to relive the trauma that you've experienced before, the better you are doing in terms of your own mental health will probably allow you to do that in a way that doesn't maybe bring you back into some of the same pain that you experienced when it was originally happening. So you can confront it and talk about it and feel it, but not necessarily be harmed by it and by reliving it. So that I think that's really, really great advice. And thank you so much for your question, that medium, Lauren. One of the benefits of tuning into these live taping sessions on my YouTube channel is you get to ask your questions of our guest co-hosts. And it looks like those are all the questions that we have today. So just tell us, MJ, where can we find you? Where do you prefer we get in touch with you if we want to learn more about you, about the Witch of Wall Street, and any of your upcoming projects?
Yeah, Instagram is a great place. So MJ Etkind author. I have a Substack, mj@etkind.substack.com. I think actually you can find, you can contact me there. And then I have emails out. So MJ Etkind at izzyhousebooks.com. You can just email directly, and hopefully I should get back. I don't get a ton of emails at that address at this point, so I should get back pretty fast.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Well, it has been so incredible having you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. And thank you for writing this book and giving us a look at a witch who's got a daily life that probably looks a lot more similar to, you know, what the rest of us are doing in our 9 to 5s than a lot of witchy characters out there. So thank you so much for being with us today. It was really fantastic to have you here. I hope to have you back on the show in the
Yeah,
future.
definitely. Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Absolutely. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you
Bye.
as well. Bye.
Where should people be looking for you? You guys make sure you go and check out that part of the episode because you're going to want to know how to keep in touch with MJ and all of the things that she's got going on. I want to thank all of you witches for tuning in to another episode of the Better Witch podcast. I've been your host, Allie Kravitz. For spiritual business tips, you can follow me on Instagram and Threads at Bronx Witch, and you can find the links to my classes, coaching programs, and more in the description of this episode. Remember, witches, when we know better, we witch better. I'll see you in the next one. Blessed be.